Tom Rinaldi, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Tell us about this new podcast project that you have rolling out.
This is a project called Wesely. It's the first ever Fox Sports episodic podcast, Ben. Fox has some great offerings in the podcast space in the guest platform mode, if you will. But this unfolds like a long-form story, episode to episode, in a serialized, narrative-driven way. It's the story of the only Major League Baseball player in the sport's history to be murdered during a season. And remarkably, Ben, it's a story that, even though it's not ancient history, has largely been forgotten. One of the highest paid players in the sport at the time, in 1978, a career .311 hitter, the son of a Negro Leagues player, a player who has a fascinating journey to ultimately get to the Angels, the team he was playing for at the time, had broken in with the Twins. And in a story that went around the world at the time, Ben, was shot point blank with a shotgun at an intersection on a Saturday night in Gary, Indiana.
You know, I had certainly heard the name. I knew kind of vaguely about this incident, but I really didn't know anything about it until I started to, listen to some of the content that you had pulled together on this, and I was pretty shocked by the audio that you were able to gather and to produce yourself around this story. Just hearing the voices of the people who were so closely and intimately involved in this. What was the significance of the story to you? Was this always one that had been sort of on your radar as being something you wanted to eventually cover?
I appreciate you saying that, Ben. I mean, we do hear from some of the great legends in the game, like Rod Carew and George Brett and other players and teammates who love and can still be brought to tears at the memory of Lyman's death and his tragic killing. We did this story 14 years ago as a television feature on ESPN, and it was a long feature when you think about TV times, Ben. It was, 13 and a half minutes long. But there's so much more to the richness of Lyman's story and to the improbability of the criminal case that unfolded against the man who killed him. A man who was identified point blank by people in the car where Lyman was killed. A man who did not deny that he raised up the shotgun and fired and took Lyman's life. And yet somehow, remarkably, less than 2 years later, was free, completely free to re-enter society, and led his life 6.5 blocks away from where he had killed Lyman. We found the killer, Ben, 14 years ago, and it's an encounter that I've regretted ever since, and I've carried that with me, and that unfolds and is described as well through the later stages of the episodes of the podcast. So that drew me back to it.
Mm. You talk about Gary, Indiana, and the level of crime that it was experiencing at the time. I don't think that's as familiar to most people. I certainly, had forgotten about the level of crime that it had experienced. What was the situation like in Gary at the time that this shooting took place?
Tragically, Ben, it's reminiscent of what it's like right now. I mean, there was just a multiple shooting this past week in that same section of Gary, Indiana. At the time, it was the murder capital of the United States of America. And where the shooting unfolded at the intersection of Jackson, 5th and Jackson, further up Jackson Street, 2300 Jackson to be specific, Ben, was the home of the Jackson 5 family, which brought great fame to Gary in the early 1970s. But Gary had been an industrial, thriving center for the steel industry. And when those jobs began to go elsewhere, Gary really began to suffer. And a cycle of poverty and crime has overwhelmed the city in a largely intractable way. There's been great efforts made to improve Gary, but it was a very deadly city, the deadliest city in America, certainly of its size per capita, at the time when Lyman was killed in 1978.
What kind of player compares to the skills that Lyman brought to the game?
That's a great question, Ben. And I think it's interesting to hear these great players light up in describing him, in what a magician he was with a bat, what a tactician he was. Not a power hitter, but could hit the ball out of the ballpark, could hit to all fields. The most consistent comparison has been to Ichiro, a player, a left-handed batter. Ichiro, who's obviously an all-time great player now in the major leagues after his career in Japan. And Lyman soaked up the lessons of Rod Carew. He broke in with the Twins when Carew was already a multiple-time batting champion. Carew even says during the series, Ben, no player wanted to learn more than Lyman did, and had a swagger about him to say, I'm going to challenge you for these batting titles, Rod. You're going to give me these lessons, but I'm going to use them to push you. And he did. He finished in the top 5 in the American League twice in his 4 seasons.
Talk to me about what he did with his salary when he didn't think that he was playing up to snuff.
I appreciate you knowing that part of the story. Just another aspect, Ben, which gives texture and shape to Lyman. And I'll ask you, and I'll ask anyone listening, if they can think of a comparable example. Lyman signed a huge contract and all the pressure that comes with it to leave the Twins and come to the Angels. He was coming back to the place where he'd spent most of his childhood, Southern California, and cratered. He had a horrendous slump in the first month as an Angel, batting 147 at the end of April. He went to the ownership of the Angels, Gene Autry, the famous singing cowboy who owned the team at the time, and refused his salary, saying, I don't think I've earned this pay. And Autry and Buzz Bavasi, the general manager, said, listen, if you hit a home run every game for the rest of the season, Lyman, we're not going to pay you any more. So just relax, take the money. Lyman did, and gave the entirety to charity for that first month. He then eventually went on a huge tear and was flirting with hitting 300 when he was tragically killed. I can't think of another, can you, Ben, of another athlete who said, I'm not earning this, don't pay me. We just don't see that in any walk of life, not just sport, in any walk of life.
I want to talk to you about some other sports questions, but before we leave the topic of this podcast series, tell us just a little bit about it and sort of the effort that you put into making it. The aspects of it that you revisited from the original piece, and just some of the things that you found along the way in revisiting the story.
So it's entitled Wesely, and it drops. The first 4 episodes, Ben, come out July 18th. And then the next Monday, another pair, and the Monday after that, the final pair. So 8 in total, but the first 4 coming out July 18, Apple, Spotify, everywhere that you get your podcasts. We hope people are brought into the late 1960s, which really form Lyman as he goes off to college, when there's great unrest and protest happening across so much of the country. Anyone who lived through the early 2020s can relate to a degree. I know it precedes you, Ben. I was just a toddler at that time, but in the late 1960s in the tumult of the country. So trying to give shape to that, the broader context of his career, his own advocacy for player movement, his own challenging of trying to be paid what he was worth. At one point, Lyman, incredibly, Ben, as a guy that finished in the top 5 in the American League in hitting, was being paid $20,000 a season. Obviously not his worth. There's so many aspects to the story, and the ability to go back and hear people really listen to that encounter with his killer, and why it's been one of the perennial regrets of my career, that I just, even though I was able to find him, I don't think I handled that moment well.
Well, I encourage people to listen to it. The parts that I've been able to listen to have been very compelling. And it certainly is a good, I think, a very positive development to have this type of approach coming to the Fox podcast family and that type of thing. It's something that I hope will lead to further projects along these lines. I appreciate
that, Ben.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about the status of sports as someone who has been around this for as long as you have. Sports in America has historically been a place where, a lot of political debates take shape, where, even if you are listening to sports talk radio, it will, veer into conversations about race and about gender and about other issues that certainly, have made it a political force in terms of, athletes who've taken strong stands on issues and the like. And yet it feels different now. Just as a viewer, to me, it feels different in the sense that even though politics has always been an aspect of it, now it feels like the politics is dominating the conversation, that it's pushing out analysis of games and of players and everything else. And it feels like when I'm listening to sports talk radio, where before it would be 20% political, now it's like 80-20 in the other way. And that really disappoints me and makes me sad as just a fan, because sports has always been a place where, regardless of the politics of the person who I'm sitting next to in the stands or at the sports bar, that was a place where we could cheer and sorrow together, regardless of who we were voting for when it came time to make that decision in November. And that, to me, is something that I just feel it lost. And I wonder if you feel the same way. And if you do, or if you don't, if there's some kind of form of optimism or hope that we can have of having sports get back to that point where it's more about unifying us than it is about dividing us.
I think, Ben, you bring up a powerful point and a very deep topic. And I have a lot of hope and optimism. And I think there are two reasons why, in essence, to oversimplify them. One, Ben, is that obviously we live in such a fractious and divided and discordant time. And yet, sport, which probably should be the starkest, most divisive institution we have, Ben wins, Tom loses. What's more divisive than that? I still see incredible moments of unity, of togetherness, of community gathering in sport that you maybe don't see as often as we once did. Yes, we can see them in educational settings or faith communities or things of this nature. But on the scale of sport, Ben, it's still awesome to see people brought together with the spectacle of the competitive venue. The second reason for my hope and optimism, Ben, is because I still believe so deeply in sport and its aspiration. It's just wonderful to see people pursue greatness. And you can assign its value in whatever way you want. What does it really mean that somebody can return a 130-mile-an-hour serve? What does it really mean that a player can make a birdie in a clutch situation? What does it really mean that a player can toe the line and make the touchdown catch? In our country, it means a lot. We assign a lot to that. And I'll always be compelled by the pursuit of greatness, Ben. What it costs, what it brings, the journeys of the athletes, the coaches, the teams, they really compel and fascinate me. And so often when I see that strength and I'm able to, as a featurist, tell stories that exceed sometimes just the absolute lines of the competitive venue itself, I'm inspired. And if I am, the hope is that those who are going to hear or read, or in this case, listen to the story of somebody like Lyman, they might feel some of that residue as well.
I wanted to ask you about the new and newly important realm of sports gambling. Obviously, with the Supreme Court decision and with other court decisions across the country, we now have a new world for sports gambling that really is incredible in terms of the things that you can gamble on, from you're sitting in the sports bar watching something and deciding to make a bet. I wonder though if there's any downside to that. Do you see this as being overwhelmingly positive in terms of what this level of sports gambling is doing in terms of raising interest perhaps for sports that haven't gotten as much attention? Or is it something that kind of takes away from that feeling of loyalty when you might be rooting in very different ways across multiple different contests as opposed to being a fan who roots for a team or roots for an athlete.
Another great topic to delve into, Ben, right? Because when you get into fantasy, for example, fantasy sport, we mean, and the thing you touched on, where does the loyalty go when you're suddenly involved in your fantasy roster? What does it mean for the tribal pull of your local team or the team that your family or your parents or those who are significant to you that they cheered for? Here, this is what I would say, and it's probably going to sound pragmatic, hopefully not cynical. I just think, Ben, it's an inevitability. Gambling is such a thriving engine in sport. And now, with everyone recognizing that and realizing, let's try perhaps to legislate it, monetize it, let's acknowledge it. Because let's face it, from the time you and I were young and we had our first interest in sports, we either bet ourselves or saw or knew people who made bets. All the way back to here's my sheet on Sundays, right now to parlay and being able to bet live during an event itself. I just think it's an inevitability. Obviously, there's dangers that come with anything in a large institution, but I think there's no way to turn a blind eye to the power of sports betting.
It is going to be interesting to see how it plays out differently with particularly younger fans, I think, who are coming up and may end up, not having that type of loyalty. Talk to me a little bit about the role that sports is playing right now when it comes to some of our areas of policy, the situation regarding Brittany Griner and some of the commentary that's been around her. She's obviously symbolic of something that is very near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, in the sense that she's a symbol of a lot of different things. Is there something that you think is lost, though, where there's this level of unseriousness, I guess, in some of the commentary around it? I think particularly of LeBron saying that she might not want to come back home. What was your reaction to that?
I didn't have a particular reaction to what LeBron said. I mean, obviously he has a massive following. He's got a massive voice, and he uses it in the way that he wishes to. I do think, Ben, what you bring up, there is, again, to use the word inevitable, there is an inevitability when we do see, we want so desperately for sport to exist in a vacuum and for it to be this refuge and this escape. But in truth, Ben, very often it does take its power by fitting into the greater context. It does inspire or move us when we do see it taking a place in the greater landscape, whether that be political, spiritual, whatever it might be. And I know there are people who really bristle at that, who want to see it stay somehow detached from every other mooring in our society. But I just don't think that's realistic. I think that when we do see it placed, and I'll go back to, Ben, I'm sure, again, I know I'm older than you, but I know I'm going to sound like the old man here, but 1980, to see the U.S. beat then the USSR, right, in Lake Placid, that's not just two teams playing, and yet it is, right? It's just two hockey teams, but it's the context around it that gives it its ultimate legend and meaning and longevity. And that's what I mean about sport not really ever existing solely off in its own vacuum.
So there's been obviously a big shakeup in terms of the football broadcasting universe. I mean, so many moves, so much money. I mean, it's been crazy to watch, and you are part of that. So tell me a little bit about what you're looking forward to in terms of the upcoming NFL season.
Well, we couldn't be more excited. We have the Super Bowl 2 of the next 3 years on Fox. In the incredibly blessed position to be a part of the broadcast team that will be there for the Super Bowl. We're super excited about Kevin Burkhardt, a great guy, a Jersey guy. I'm a Jersey guy, and we try to stick together. Jersey's so much better than people people want to give it credit for. And we're excited about having Greg Olsen. He has been with Kevin already. And, of course, the announcement about Tom Brady, whenever the time comes that he chooses, who knows when that's going to be, that he'll join the booth. I'm thrilled.
It'll be about 2054.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows as he continues to reverse age and make the rest of us, or at least me, look bad. We're thrilled about the opportunities that come with this season. Plus, it's just a remarkable fall. We have the World Cup on Fox this fall. The U.S. has some real promise in its group play. We'll see if it can advance past there. We have Michigan, Ohio State. We have a great slate of college football, the World Series, all those things. Couldn't be more excited about the fall.
How much effort, or how do you approach the preparation for covering a game on Sunday? How much time do you spend studying the teams? What do you do in order to prepare?
I think a big part of that, Ben, is obviously to stay abreast as best you can across all the teams in the conference that we cover, the NFC. But I find great value in our production meetings and calls with the players and the coaches. Their candor, their willingness to share with us things that might give greater context and insight to help a viewer. And I think our booth does a great job at that. When Greg Olsen talks to these players, he has their respect. He played very recently at a very high level, and me asking a question like that, Ben, is going to get a different answer than Greg Olsen asking those questions. So that's a big part of the prep.
I have to ask you a personal interest question here. I am, for my sins, a Washington fan. And have been for my whole life.
In football, or in all things?
Football.
Ben?
In football,
okay.
in most things.
In most things, okay.
And when it came, and
I know you're a William and Mary guy, so that's that whole. Okay, got it. All right.
So when I look at the franchise currently. I mean, it's.
But I have to stop. Your whole posture just changed. Look at this.
It's just
Ben,
everything's horrible.
There are places you can call. There are people who can help. You can avail yourselves of these things.
Yes. Well, let's just say it's a combination of like heartburn and depression and like not just feeling like. I mean, the Wentz signing, the fact is, I like Ron Rivera. I like him a lot, but he is old fashioned in a lot of ways. And just the overall dynamic in that front office seems to have been completely off. And now there's, congressional investigations and there's, all sorts of other things that are going on. They have a terrible stadium location and really, haven't found something better. Is there any reason for me to hope that going into this season that they'll be able to right the ship in any respect, or am I just going to be made fun of by the Ravens friends that I have across the way for the foreseeable future?
I'll give you 3 very short answers, hopefully that provide some reason for hope. Okay, I'll go micro, macro. Micro, the division you play in is not stacked. That, right? So that's a reason for some hope. Number 2, you're good defensively. You have to work some things out offensively, but you're good defensively. Macro, we can point so often, Ben, to teams that no one saw coming, who have dramatic turnarounds. And Ron Rivera is one of the most respected coaches in the league, and I think he commands the respect, clearly, of his players in the locker room as well as beyond. So those are some reasons for hope.
Mm-hmm. I think that I agree with everything you've said.
But it didn't mean anything, I could tell.
I think that, well, no, it does. What it means is, I think you're right, and that's if I stay back at a remove, then that's probably how I would see things too. But it just seems so dysfunctional. I don't know. I realize that every team that every franchise that feels like it's not doing well thinks it's the worst thing ever, and I try not to have that attitude towards things, but not with this ownership and this and the way that they've approached things. I'm not all that positive, but we'll see. Let's wrap up with this. I know that in terms of where you pay attention to sports. You certainly have been a major part of sports media for a long time, very recognizable face and that kind of thing. What needs to change about the way that the media covers sports generally? Do you think that there's a good job being done generally by a lot of different folks, or is there something that's out of whack with the way that sports media, particularly on the television side, has approached doing their job?
I think one of the biggest challenges, Ben, and anyone would tell you this, certainly folks who dedicate themselves, work so hard in our trucks, is the perennial constant challenge to really capture the speed and power as it continues to evolve, particularly, let's say, in football, in the NFL, in college football. And I think we do as good a job, I think we do the best job across all the networks with carrying innovation forward, audio, different camera angles, all the different things we did. We deployed incredible technological advance in the USFL for that season, which just wrapped up with a great championship game. But the in-stadium experience and being close, and I'm so privileged to be on a sideline, Ben, and see these enormous, incredible athletes collide with one another, to see the speed with which they can make one cut, go through a tiny sliver of a hole, and then gain 20, 50, 80 yards is breathtaking. And trying to capture that and convey that to home in the era of the smart TV and everything else it's a perennial, really invigorating challenge, I think. I also think this, Ben, and Lord knows I'm guilty of it maybe more than anybody. Let the game breathe.
Yeah.
Not every moment needs a voice to chronicle it. Let it breathe.
Tom Rinaldi, good luck with this new podcast project, Wesely, which premieres on July 18th with the first 4 episodes, as you said. And thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Ben.